Now, a really important step is to obviously just take a look around all of the files within our fresh Laravel installation. We'll briefly cover everything just so that when you are going through this, it makes a lot more sense where everything is, and I'll give a little overview of what everything is or does and its purpose. So let's start by just opening up that fresh folder within our text editor. And you can see there's quite a lot here. It does look pretty overwhelming, but really this is actually quite straightforward. Most of it you don't need to touch, and most of it is very easy to grasp. So let's just start with the root directory and all of these files here. So first of all, we have a .env file, and we're going to cover this a little bit later, and all this is responsible for our environmental variables, which we can pick up with configuration. And this helps when you are switching projects. So for example, you want to put something on another server, but you want the settings on another server to be slightly different. Well, you don't have to modify any code within your main configuration, which we'll look at in a moment. You can just modify your environment variables, and then that will go ahead and get everything set up for you. And this also has the benefit of if you're using some kind of continuous integration service to deploy and run tests, you might need to add environmental variables there as well. And it also means that you're not hard coding all your configuration, and say you had, a database password here, you don't want to include that in your main source file, and you don't want to push this to any kind of code hosting service like GitHub or Bitbucket. So we also have this env.example file. You should leave this as well. This just serves as what kind of environmental variables you have, but without your actual passwords and without all your API keys or anything like that. So we have a couple of Git files. We won't really talk about them too much. We don't really need to touch them as part of the framework. And we have obviously our composer.json file. If you've worked with Composer, you'll know exactly what this is. It just tells us what kind of dependencies we need. Now notice that this is actually requiring in Laravel framework. So what we have here is the Laravel repository, which is just a kind of skeleton application. The actual framework sits in another repository, and it's used by this kind of skeleton. So that's why we see that. We see some development requirements like Faker, which helps us generate fake data, Mockery for mocking for testing, PHP unit is obviously for testing as well, and a couple of Symfony components, and we don't really need to worry too much about anything else here. So we've also got our gulp file, which uses Elixir. This is just a package within Laravel that allows you to very easily just build things up on the front end. But again, we're focusing on the kind of back end of Laravel, so we're not going to talk about Elixir too much. And apart from that, there's not really much here that's too interesting. So let's start in our app folder. This is where you'll spend most of your time creating things. And we have quite a few things in here. We're not going to cover all of them, but let's cover the most important parts. So HTTP is where everything like your controllers, middleware requests go, and also your routes as well. This is the kind of entry point into your application via URIs. And of course, we'll be covering them. Of course, we'll be covering controllers, middleware, and we'll have a look at requests as well. So next is just folders like exceptions. Now, this handler here works to handle things like 404s or 500 errors, and your application will throw things like model not found exception. We'll see what this means later, but really this is just somewhere where you won't usually touch unless you want some kind of very custom functionality. So as long as we know it's there, you can also go ahead and create your own exceptions and store them in here as well. But we're not going to really be covering that too much. Exceptions aren't really a very specific part to Laravel. Now, I guess in order of what we'll cover is our service providers. Service providers basically just help you kind of boot up your application. So for example, we have something like a root service provider, and you can see here that this kind of helps us along, and it does things like group under namespaces here, and we'll talk about that later as well. And really, all of this is just pretty standard with Laravel. The event service provider is where you would bind or listen rather for events. So again, you have events stored up here. Now, an event is something that happens in your application. Now, so for example, a user signs up. Well, what would you want to do when a user signs up? Well, you could throw an event, and then part of that, you could, for example, have a listener to then place their data details in a database, Or you could have another listener, so you can have multiple listeners for one event, to perhaps send them a welcome email. And you might have another listener to go ahead and send their photo off that they've uploaded to some kind of service for resizing. So this is the kind of things that events do, and also our listeners do here as well. And you can see these are pretty bare. We just have a kind of base event here. So all of this kind of stuff can be generated with Artisan, which we're going to cover in a moment as well. We also have things like jobs as well. Jobs are basically just things that we can dispatch from controllers. Now all that means is we just run them from a controller, and this helps to keep our controllers nice and tidy. So some really kind of alien stuff maybe, but really the series here we're going to be focusing on mainly controllers, our routing, and kind of stuff like that. So don't worry too much about all of these things. They're obviously going to be covered elsewhere on Code Course as well. So coming out of the app directory then, we have our resources folder. Now you'll spend a lot of time in here as well because this is where we create our views. So think about the MVC pattern. We have routing inside of HTTP. And for example, the home page just immediately renders a view here. But of course, what we could do is pass this off to a controller method. That controller method could then render a view. Now in our case, the home page is just rendering this welcome.blade.php file, which just comes as part of Laravel, and that's what you can see just here. So this is the code for that page. So pretty straightforward. You'll notice that these are named with a blade.php extension. Blade is the template engine that Laravel uses. So you might have heard of things like Twig, but Blade is what we're going to be using when we work with Laravel. Of course, you can use Twig with Laravel, but that's another story. So we also have things like assets. This is what I was talking about earlier when we spoke about Elixir. Our assets we can just use, for example, SAS or less, and we can kind of build things up using Elixir. But again, that's more front end. We don't really want to talk about that too much. We also have language files as well. So if you want to modify things in here, you can go ahead and do so. And as long as you have the correct language folder with the correct files, languages can be overwritten. So pretty straightforward stuff. Okay, so over to our config directory. These just serve as the config for your entire application. And of course, you can add other configuration files as well. And of course, we will be looking in this series at how we work with configuration as well. So for example, our database configuration. Let's just take a look at what we use here. Obviously, Laravel uses Eloquent, which uses PDO, and we'll talk about Eloquent later, but we can have multiple drivers, so we can use different databases. Now, in our case, we're going to be using MySQL, and notice here that we are pulling that environment variable. Remember earlier I spoke about the importance of an environmental variable and our config, like our username or our password to our database, not being available hard-coded into our config. So all of this env helper function does is it pulls the configuration value. So you can see here that database password, if we just open up our env file, is just there. So you'll dive into your config quite a lot, and there are so many different things that we can change here. There are lots and lots of things. So I'd recommend that you just go through and have a good look at that. And if you don't want to, that's fine. At some point or another, you'll dive into your config and try to find something. So then over to our database folder. Now this contains a few things. We're going to focus on migrations, and I'll talk a little bit about seeding, although we're not going to cover that. So migrations are essentially a way to migrate your database creation. So think about it this way. Normally when you're building an application, you might go into your database, you might create a new table, you might add some columns, add some test data. Well, we can do this all from Laravel, and it's highly recommended that we do that. Well, why would we write code to generate tables and generate columns? Well, the reason that we do this is because we can roll back migrations. Essentially, if you transfer your projects to maybe another server, all you need to do to build all of your database schema is just run your migrations. That will create everything for you. I'm sure we've all been in the situation where when we want to move a project, we've had to export the schema from MySQL and then import it into our database later on. And that's really annoying. So let's just take a look at one of these migrations and see what it looks like. All of this code might look a little bit overwhelming at first, but don't worry too much. We can actually generate a lot of this on the command line. So it's pretty straightforward. So this schema facade here, which we'll be talking about facades later, essentially allows us to just build up our table. And if you just take a quick look at this, you'll see how simple it is, and it will probably make a lot of sense. So just as a more complex example, we've got our users table just here. We have an incrementing primary key called ID. We have a string, which will essentially be a varchar for our name and our email. We want our email to be unique. Our password to have a length of 60, or this is again a varchar and it has a max of 60. And there's so many things we do here. And notice that we have a down method as well, which just drops that table. Of course, if you wanted to add a new column, you could create a new migration, and all that would do is create a new column, and then it would, in the reverse, so in the down method, it would just remove that column. So adding when we go up, removing when we go down. So this really helps when you're going live with something and you think, oh, I need to get rid of everything and roll back everything. You just run one simple command and all of your database schema changes will be rolled back to the previous state. So enough about migrations. We're going to cover these in quite a bit of depth later on. Seeding, which we won't be covering, is essentially the concept of populating your database with data so you can start working with it. So it's really useful. It's pretty straightforward to do as well. You just need to know how to create models or create data via a model or just insert into your database. And of course, we'll be covering that in the series so you can go ahead and create seeds for whatever you want later on. So factories just here are mainly for testing. So all we do is we define a kind of factory builder for example, our user model. And we just return using faker, which we saw in our composer.json file, a name, email, password, and remember token. So really, really easy to work with when you're working with testing. But of course, we are not really going to cover this too much. It's an entirely different kind of concept. So apart from that, there's not many places you'll want to dive into. Your public directory, you're never really going to need to touch. Of course, when you do build up your assets, so all your styles, maybe with Sass, you build up your JavaScript, of course, these will be placed in directories here, but they'll only be done when we're kind of running everything on the server. So don't worry too much about that just yet. We also have storage, so if anything goes wrong, it's really useful to come over to the logs. So if we see any errors, these will just be dated, they'll just be log files, and you can just click on them and kind of see the stack trace of where things went wrong. And these are really useful just to debug or anything like that. And we can also log directly to these as part of Laravel as well, using Laravel's log component. So hopefully that's given you a good overview of the kind of structure of our Laravel project. Of course, we'll be diving into each part in more depth. We might even open up a few more files and take a look at them and what they do. But for now, you should have a good understanding of what everything is, how to work your way around, and you can continue on building things up within these.